Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, October 5th. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Thanks so much for joining me again, Jacob, to launch the week here in Israel.
And what a week it's looking to be. Good to be with you, Amanda.
Indeed, and intensive negotiations to potentially finalize the Trump peace plan are set for Monday in Egypt, and Israel and Hamas are sending teams, and U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner are set to join with Arab mediators in a potentially final attempt to broker the agreement to release all Israeli hostages and end the almost 2-year war in the Gaza Strip. So Jacob will fill us in with some of Hamas's amendments to the 20-point deal, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has issued a cautiously optimistic statement that he hopes to see the hostages back home even during the approaching Sukkot holiday. So with all eyes on Monday's meetup, we'll discuss all of this and more when we're back. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Jacob, exactly a week ago, you and I carefully went through a leaked draft of Trump's then 21-point plan, and a lot has happened since, and we'll hopefully cover all of it. But the main issue that's confusing me about Hamas's response to the now 20-point plan is whether the terrorist group, which has been holding Israeli hostages and using them as bargaining chips and human shields for the past 2 years, whether this terrorist group is really signing onto a deal that would see the hostages, living and dead, released even before the IDF draws down completely from Gaza. So what are your feelings on this, Jacob?
It's definitely a massive shift. But from my understanding, speaking to some of the Arab diplomats from mediating countries, but also just reading Hamas's response, that is what this major shift that they've been willing to move forward with. Now, there is plenty of caveats, and there still need to be negotiations. I think the excitement coming out of Washington is real, but also I think we need to be cautiously optimistic, I would say. But yes, the concept right now is they're giving all of their leverage up front and not even getting a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. If you look at that map that was sent out by the White House, it allows Israel to remain in the majority of Gaza, maybe 65-70% of Gaza, even after all the hostages are released. And Prime Minister Netanyahu even talks about this massive success in terms of Israel's ability to remain in so much of Gaza, even after Hamas has lost all of its bargaining chips. What I think happened is that Qatar and also Egypt and Turkey, to a lesser extent, managed to convince Hamas over the past few days that the hostages were now more of a liability than an asset. And in addition to being able to prove that Trump was capable of pressuring Netanyahu, of holding his feet to the fire, of actually keeping maybe potential guarantees, that I guess Hamas is more willing to accept assurances from the U.S. that, yes, there won't be a complete withdrawal, but this war will be permanently over, at least in its current form. I think Qatari and Egyptian mediators that I spoke with pointed to this apology that Qatar managed to secure from Netanyahu, that President Trump sat Netanyahu down in the Oval Office and had him read a script. And then not only that, but photographed the apology as it was unfolding and then published the footage of it afterwards, which is really quite a remarkable display of, I guess, power from Trump's part and an embarrassment in many ways for Netanyahu, given that this is something in the weeks after the strike on September 9th, this was not something that Netanyahu was willing to do. So as a result of that, what we saw is Moussa Abu Marzouk, the senior Hamas official in Qatar, say to Al Jazeera on Friday night that, yes, we're basically willing to accept the first 9 points of this U.S. proposal. They're front-loading everything, and I think they're making this a yes but, which is basically their response. And I think the hope was that Trump would agree with that and be willing to move forward. And that is seemingly what happened, that Trump is absolutely ecstatic about this Hamas response. He even publishes the entire English statement on his Truth Social without any of the other commentary. So clearly something that he's comfortable with enough to at least a small degree. And I think that is why we're able to move forward with negotiations. That there's still going to be questions about how much Netanyahu's coalition can withstand this. But it seems like for now, there's a lot of, it seems like goodwill from both parties to make the decisions necessary to at least get the hostages out, and then also hold negotiations about the much thornier issues that I think will be a lot harder to reach agreements on.
Okay, so one of the thorny issues is Israel's real insistence that Hamas must be demilitarized and not in power of the Gaza Strip anymore after this war. And in the Hamas response, there's one line, it's the final line, that really, to me, gives a lot of insight into their thinking. So I'll just read this out. The other issues mentioned in President Trump's proposal regarding the future of the Gaza Strip and the inherent rights of the Palestinian people are linked to a comprehensive national position and based on relevant international laws and resolution. Now, here's the line. They are to be discussed within a comprehensive Palestinian national framework. Hamas will be part of it and will contribute to it with full responsibility. So that does not, to me, sound like a party who's willing to bow out of power entirely and leave the strip alone.
Correct. I think that they're trying to say that we don't need to be the front of the face of the government. They even say in their statement a little bit above what you read about willingness to accept a Palestinian independent government of technocrats that doesn't include Hamas. But obviously they want to be able to have some sort of say behind the scenes. If you look at the Trump proposal, it talks about that Hamas can't have a role in the governance of Gaza directly or indirectly. So whether or not that leaves some sort of opening for at least their existence, maybe you could argue that it does. And actually, President Trump in his Truth Social message on Friday does talk about the idea that they can live and still exist in many ways, even if this deal moves forward. That he even says they're interested in peace when he calls shockingly for Israel to stop the bombing for the first time of the war. That's something we have not seen the U.S. president do. Biden, not even, and now Trump is the one to do it. So yes, there's definitely massive gaps, I think, remaining regarding how the question of demilitarization, I think what Hamas is trying to argue in the negotiations that will happen and is already quietly doing so ahead of time, is this concept of differentiation between defensive and offensive weapons. They'll give up their rockets, but maybe some of the other guns that they have, they want to be able to use and argue that it's for defensive reasons. Obviously, that is not necessarily the case when they're being used against Israeli forces, but also against to maintain control and push fear amongst Palestinians who are trying to look for a potential other idea for another ruler in Gaza as well. So I think that's going to be probably something that the mediators and the U.S. will have a harder line in accepting. But again, I think if there is a possibility that this is going to be a staged process of demilitarization or disarmament, that could be something that the parties get behind, especially because, while yes, Israel does not want to see Hamas remaining with weapons in Gaza, but the fact is, for now, and until there's an agreement, Israel is going to remain in the vast majority of Gaza, so that it's much less of a threat. And I think that's why Netanyahu is in a position to say that we're willing to accept the fact that we might not be getting everything we want up front on that issue, but if we can get the hostages back in the meantime, this is a somewhat of a compromise that I'm willing to make.
Okay, let's go to a short break and then we'll discuss what the Prime Minister is saying. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with the U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Now, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Saturday night said, quote, "Our intention and the intention of our American friends is to bind the negotiations in a matter of days." And he said that in the second phase of the deal, Hamas will be disarmed and the Gaza Strip will be demilitarized. It will happen either diplomatically, according to the Trump plan, or militarily by us. And this is something that I'm finding really interesting as well, in that there is this little push-pull in terms of, at least, Trump in how he's relating to Hamas as well. He was overjoyed, as you said, by the response from Hamas, but he also said they better do it really quickly or else. There is this or else that is a continual theme, and it appears to me, at least, that America is willing for Israel to be the or else here.
I think there is still a real possibility that, again, what we heard from Trump on Friday night, that the bombing needs to stop. And you even hear it in some of the messaging that Trump himself is saying. He had a phone interview with Axios reporter Barak Ravid on Saturday, where he says that Bibi has gone very far in Gaza. I think he was careful not to say too far, because then there would be some sort of U.S. complicity in that. But there is a feeling amongst Trump and his inner circle that enough has been done in Gaza, that the time is now to end this war. At the same time, as you mentioned in his speech at the White House on Monday, he has said, Israel, you will have the green light if Hamas doesn't agree. But I think he also needs to balance the views of the Arab partners who he's relying on massively, namely Qatar, but also other countries, to stabilize Gaza after the war is over, that they want this war to end. And that therefore this notion that he's going to simply give a blank check that's going to be timeless, I think, is not very realistic. I think there will be a point, if this war does pick up again, which I don't necessarily think we're there yet, that Trump is still going to say, no, this needs to end at some point.
Right. In the meantime, as you mentioned, Trump strongly advised Netanyahu to stop the bombing, at least, and the army has been told to move to defensive, not offensive operations, meaning if troops are imminently meant to be attacked, they can, of course, fire on the Hamas operative. And everything is kind of at a standstill until Monday, which is a bit weird if you want to think about it, Jacob. It seems like quite a shame to lose a full day when there's such a, optimistic momentum. Why do you think this is happening?
Yeah, I do think it's unfortunate. I do know that Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy, and Jared Kushner, who's, I guess you could say, his predecessor and is still playing a very massive role in all this, they're already en route, as we're speaking, to Cairo. And I think actually the negotiations will be in Sharm el-Sheikh, just on the border. But I think there will still be negotiations that are unfolding in the next 24 hours during Sunday, even if they're not like the formal ones. Israel's sending a team that is supposed to not get there till maybe Monday, but it's possible they could get there early. And even if they're not there, I think there will be negotiations that are still happening. But yes, I think that is a little bit perplexing given how urgent this issue is for both for President Trump, but also for the hostages and their families, that they're not taking advantage of every second that they have. But to be honest, that's kind of been the nature of a lot of these talks throughout this war. That's kind of one of the reasons why it's extended for 2 years, is that there hasn't been sometimes the sense of urgency that you would think that there needs to be.
So in a really unique statement, Chief Sephardic Rabbi David Yosef, at the very start of a weekly homily that he delivers every week at the end of Shabbat, he said he called on Israeli faithful to pray that leaders make the right decisions. And the whole 2 years of the war will be decided in the coming days, he said. And let us pray both that the hostages will return to good and peaceful lives, and also that Hamas will no longer be heard in our lands. And this is pretty much the polar opposite from what we're hearing from, for example, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and also the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. So tell us what's being said by them.
So both Ben-Gvir and Smotrich have expressed real reservations with this agreement, but they're taking a slightly different approach, each of them. I think it's Ben-Gvir who is saying that if Hamas is allowed to remain in power or as a source in Gaza in any form, after the hostages are released, he'll collapse the government. And Smotrich is also very upset with the fact that Netanyahu agreed to Trump's demand to halt fighting. He feels the negotiations should be held under fire. I will note that there have been several dozen Palestinians who were killed in strikes throughout the Strip and mainly in Gaza City on Saturday, including children, and some very gruesome strikes, at least the footage that came out afterwards. Israel said that it was targeting Hamas fighters that were posing a threat to troops, but to say that there's been no gunfire or airstrikes happening since Trump's demand on Friday night wouldn't be so accurate. But bottom line, what's unique about both the Smotrich and Ben-Gvir responses is they're not saying right now we're going to be collapsing the government. Both of them on their own also don't have the real ability to do so. What I assume Netanyahu is trying to convince them to do is hold off to see what happens until after the hostages are released. What Netanyahu maybe will argue is that at that point Hamas will violate the terms or won't agree to disarm in the way that Israel wants it to, and then Israel will be able to resume the fight and we'll have all the hostages back, and there's no reason for you, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, to pull out of the government. In the meantime, the government is still needed to vote on the concept of releasing Palestinian security prisoners, specifically these 250 ones who are serving life sentences. I would expect that if you have 26 ministers in this government, that the 6 of them from Ben-Gvir and Smotrich's party will probably vote against that, but that doesn't give you enough. It's possible you could have up 1 or 2, maybe Amichai Shikli is someone in the Likud. I think David Amsalem, also another Likud minister, voted against hostage deals in the past. But that still doesn't give you the majority that would be needed to collapse that agreement. So I think there's probably a recognition from Ben Gvir and Smotrich that there's only so much kicking and screaming they can do. Ultimately, that this deal is going to go forward, and they want to be able to at least maintain their spots in the government for now. On the other hand, we're into an election year. October 2026 is the latest elections can be held. So maybe the feeling is we might as well come out at a point where we're on our own terms, as opposed to Netanyahu being the one to make the decision to collapse it. It's going to be sometime in the next 12 months. So maybe it could start this process as early as by the beginning of 2026.
And we still obviously don't know what's going to come out of the talks on Monday, and it is quite possible that Hamas will not agree to the terms.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, there's a lot of thorny issues in these talks that we didn't get to talk a little bit too much about. But like, for example, that Hamas isn't holding all of the living hostages. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad is holding Ron Baslavsky, and there might be other groups that are holding bodies or other hostages. Though that's the one that I know of for sure. That's well known. And yes, Hamas has a lot of control over the other groups, but they initially, as we talked about earlier on this podcast, that PIJ came out against this proposal. Then they walked back a little bit and said that they would be willing to accept it under certain conditions. But that's going to be one of the very difficult parts of this. There's also this 250 security prisoners that are going to be released. That is almost, I think there'll only be several dozen left in Israeli prisons from the start of the war, given how many have been released during these hostage releases. I'm sure Hamas will be insisting on getting Marwan Barghouti and other major prominent Palestinian prisoners out. And that's going to be something that there's going to be a lot of pressure just to simply get a deal done. And we'll see who will be feeling more heat. Will it be Hamas to just cave, or for Israel to just cave? It'll probably be coming from both sides. But these negotiations, as much as there's a lot of momentum and excitement from Trump that this feels like it's almost a done deal at this point, but these negotiations will be very, very difficult. I don't think we're going to have a deal tomorrow. It's going to take some time. But hopefully, as Netanyahu says, by the start of Sukkot or during Sukkot, we'll have some or all the hostages home.
Amen. Jacob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by Adina Karpuch. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, Shalom.